After years away, Navy SEAL Ethan Cole finally returned to Pine Ridge with Rex, his retired military German Shepherd, hoping to surprise his elderly father. Near town, Ethan stopped at a small diner to eat and buy his father's favorite meal before heading home. Before Ethan could get closer, the diner owner came outside, shouted at the old man, and dumped a bucket of cold water over him. Then the old man raised his face, and Ethan realized the person being humiliated in front of everyone was his own father, Walter. Ethan rushed to help him while Rex stood between Walter and the diner owner, but Walter grabbed Ethan's arm and whispered, "You shouldn't have come back. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from today. And please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and bring you more stories like this." For most of the drive home, Ethan Cole had imagined his father standing on the porch, not crying. Walter Cole was not a man who cried where people could see him. Ethan pictured the old man squinting toward the road, pretending the sudden appearance of his son after years away was an inconvenience. "You could called." That was probably what Walter would say. Then he would hug Ethan hard enough to prove he had been waiting. At 46, Ethan had spent much of his adult life serving as a Navy SEAL. Distance had become something he understood in miles, flight hours, deployment cycles, and missed holidays. Pine Ridge had remained fixed somewhere behind all of that, a place he could return to once the next assignment ended. The next assignment always came. Beside him, Rex occupied most of the rear seat. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had spent years working as a military working dog alongside Ethan. Age had finally begun showing in the slight stiffness of Rex's right shoulder after long periods of rest, and retirement had come a few months earlier. Ethan had adopted him as soon as the paperwork allowed. This was their first long drive together with nowhere tactical to be at the end of it. No briefing, no equipment inspection, no command waiting, just home. Rex lifted his head when Ethan turned off the interstate. "You remember this place?" One amber-brown eye appeared in the mirror. Ethan smiled. "Yeah, me neither. It was nearly true. Pine Ridge existed in fragments now. Walter's workshop smelling of machine oil. A kitchen table scarred by Ethan's pocket knife when he was 12. Summer heat on the porch boards. His mother laughing before illness had made laughter less common in that house. Ethan had originally told no one he was coming. He wanted Walter to open the door and find him there. But less than an hour outside town, practical instinct won over sentiment. Ethan called his cousin Calvin. Calvin Cole was 42, 4 years younger than Ethan, and had become the person Ethan depended on whenever Walter needed something that could not be solved over a phone. Walter hated smartphones, distrusted online banking, and still preferred checks and cash. Years earlier, Calvin had offered a simple arrangement: send the money to him. He would handle the prescriptions, property tax, utilities, repairs, whatever Walter refused to admit he needed. For years, the arrangement seemed to work. Calvin answered on the 4th ring. "Ethan, coming into town." There was a short silence. "Today? Don't tell Dad." Calvin laughed. Still trying to surprise a 74-year-old man. Brave. "How is he?" "Same as always. Stubborn. Complains if I spend $10 on him. Complains if I don't." Ethan relaxed. "And last month? Handled. The prescription too? Everything." Ethan looked through the windshield at the Tennessee hills folding toward Pine Ridge. "Thanks, Cal." Later, those 2 words would return to him more often than he wanted. At the time, they felt natural. Mill Creek Diner appeared 10 miles outside town, its weathered red sign standing beside the highway. Ethan pulled in. He had been driving since before sunrise, and Rex needed to stretch. More importantly, Walter loved Mill Creek's beef stew. Ethan decided he would eat something, get coffee, and bring home a container large enough for his father to complain that it was too much food. He parked near the end of the building. Rex climbed down carefully, stretched his front legs, then shook himself from nose to tail. The dog took 3 steps toward the diner, stopped. Ethan nearly walked past him. "Rex?" The German Shepherd's ears were forward, not toward the entrance, toward the side wall. Ethan followed his gaze. An old man sat beneath the narrow overhang beside the building. His brown canvas coat was worn through at one elbow. His trousers had faded almost colorless at the knees. One work boot was held together near the front with a length of black cord. A paper cup sat on the pavement beside him. Several coins were inside. Ethan looked once, then again. Something in his mind refused to connect the image with the person it resembled. Rex did not hesitate. The dog pulled against the leash, not violently, urgently. Then Rex made a sound Ethan had rarely heard from him in all their years together, a low, almost wounded whine. The old man raised his head, blue-grey eyes, white hair pushed back by one rough hand. Ethan stopped breathing. "Dad?" Walter did not hear him. Or perhaps Ethan had not actually spoken loudly enough. He could not tell. For a few seconds, the world around him kept moving while Ethan remained still. A truck passed on the road. Dishes clattered inside the diner. Someone laughed behind the glass. His father was sitting beside a paper cup with coins in it. And Ethan had spent the drive home wondering whether Walter would pretend not to be surprised. The diner door opened. A stocky man in a dark green apron stepped outside carrying a plastic bucket. Bert Hanley, though Ethan did not know his name yet, had a broad face, thinning salt and pepper hair, and the irritated expression of someone dealing with a problem he believed should already have disappeared. "I told you yesterday." Walter put one hand against the wall and tried to rise. "Bert, I was just... No, not today." Walter's left leg had gone stiff from sitting. He struggled to get his weight beneath him. Ethan started forward. Bert tipped the bucket. Cold water struck Walter across the chest and shoulders. Walter gasped and dropped back against the wall. The bucket hit the pavement. Ethan was already running. Rex reached Walter with him. "Enough." Ethan did not shout. He did not need to. Bert took one step forward. Rex moved between them. The German shepherd planted all four paws and lowered his head slightly. A quiet growl rolled from deep in his chest. Bert stopped. Rex did not lunge, did not snap. He simply made it clear that another step would be noticed. A few breakfast customers had come outside. One man shook his head. That old guy again. Another looked at Ethan's military clothing and said, "Buddy, don't ruin your gear helping him. Guy smells like he sleeps in a ditch." Ethan heard every word. He answered none of them. He knelt beside Walter. Water dripped from his father's white hair. The old coat was soaked through. Ethan put one hand beneath Walter's arm. Only then did he realize how little his father weighed. That frightened him more than Bert had. Behind the diner window stood a small woman with auburn and grey hair pinned behind one ear. Her name tag read Helen. Helen Pierce looked to be in her early 60s. One hand was pressed to the glass. For a moment Ethan thought she was coming outside. She did not. Her eyes dropped. Ethan filed that away without knowing why. He removed his outer jacket and wrapped it around Walter's shoulders. Walter finally looked directly at him. Confusion came first, then recognition. His mouth opened. "Ethan?" "Yeah, Dad." Walter gripped his forearm. For one second Ethan expected relief, maybe disbelief, maybe anger that he had not called. Instead, Walter's expression changed into something Ethan had never expected to see on his father's face: fear. Walter looked past him. Across the road, a black pickup was pulling away from the far end of the lot. Walter's fingers tightened. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan stared at him. "What?" Walter watched the pickup disappear around the bend. "You shouldn't have come back now." "Dad, why?" Walter seemed to realize he had said too much. He lowered his eyes. "Just get me home." Walter barely spoke during the drive. Rex lay across the back seat with his head resting on Walter's knee. Walter's hand moved slowly over the dog's left ear, pausing near the small V-shaped notch along the edge. "You got old," Walter murmured. Rex closed his eyes. Ethan almost laughed. Almost. He kept looking at Walter in the mirror instead. The wet hair. The worn coat beneath Ethan's jacket. The boot held together with cord. Every detail seemed to accuse him of something he could not yet name. "What happened?" Walter looked out the window. "Nothing worth making a production over. You were sitting outside a diner with a cup on the ground. People put the coins there. That's supposed to make me feel better?" Walter did not answer. Ethan tightened his hands on the steering wheel. "Does Calvin know you've been going there?" That changed something. Walter turned from the window. "Calvin knows you're back? I called him before town." "When?" "About an hour ago." Walter went quiet. Not stubborn quiet. Calculating quiet. Ethan recognized the difference. He had spent enough years around dangerous situations to know when someone had just received information they did not want. Walter looked toward the road behind them, then forward again. "We need to get home before he does." Ethan glanced at him. "Why?" Walter rubbed Rex behind the ear. "Just drive." For the first time since entering Pine Ridge, Ethan obeyed his father without asking another question. That evening, Ethan stood near the kitchen window while Walter changed into dry clothes in the next room. The image outside the diner would not leave him. The paper cup, the water hitting Walter. The way Walter had looked at the black pickup. Ethan had returned believing he knew exactly what kind of son he had been. Not perfect, absent too often, but responsible. He called, he sent money, he made sure Walter was taken care of, or at least he had believed he did. His phone vibrated. "Calvin," Ethan answered. "Yeah?" Calvin sounded casual. "Everything okay?" Ethan looked toward the hallway. "What do you mean?" A pause. Then Calvin said, "You get Uncle Walter home from the diner, all right?" Ethan said nothing. His eyes moved slowly toward Walter. He had never told Calvin he stopped at Mill Creek. He had never told Calvin he found Walter there, and he had certainly never told him he had brought Walter home. Calvin spoke again. "Ethan?" Ethan kept the phone against his ear, but now he was listening differently. Ethan let Calvin's call end without asking the question pressing hardest against his teeth. "How did you know about the diner?" He lowered the phone slowly. Across the kitchen, Walter stood in dry clothes. One hand resting on the back of an old wooden chair. He had not asked who called. From the way his eyes settled on Ethan's face, he already knew. "Calvin?" Walter said. Ethan nodded. Walter looked away. For now, Ethan let him. There were too many questions in the house already. And for the first time since pulling into the driveway earlier that afternoon, Ethan actually looked at the place. Not as the house where he had grown up, as evidence of how his father had been living. The kitchen ceiling carried a brown water stain nearly 4 feet across. One edge had darkened where rain had come through repeatedly. A plastic bucket sat beneath it, empty tonight but marked by a pale mineral ring halfway up the side. The old heating vent beneath the window clicked, stopped, clicked again. A weak breath of warm air came out. Then nothing. Ethan walked into the living room. The floorboard near the hallway flexed under his boot. 2 front windows had plywood covering the lower panes. The curtains his mother had chosen years ago were still there, faded almost white where the sun reached them. Outside, the porch sagged several inches at the left corner. The fence along the driveway had collapsed into the weeds. The gutter on the north side hung loose from the roof, and above it all, blue plastic tarp stretched over a section of shingles, weighted down with bricks and 2 lengths of warped lumber. Ethan stared at it. He remembered the message. Storm tore up part of Uncle Walt's roof. Bad one. He remembered stopping in the middle of dinner overseas to make the transfer. $8,400. Calvin had replied less than 20 minutes later. "Got it. I'll handle everything." Ethan had slept better that night. That memory suddenly made him sick. Dad. Walter was behind him now. Ethan pointed toward the ceiling. "How long has that been leaking?" Walter followed his finger. "Depends which part." Ethan turned. "That isn't an answer. It's the answer I've got." Walter walked toward the kitchen. Ethan followed. He opened the refrigerator. A carton of eggs. Half a jar of mustard. 2 apples beginning to soften. A plastic container of beans. 3 slices of bread sealed inside a bag with a clothespin. Ethan kept the refrigerator door open longer than necessary. Walter reached around him and closed it. "You're letting the cold out." Ethan looked at his father. Walter looked completely serious. Something inside Ethan shifted. Not anger yet. Something closer to disbelief. "I sent money." Walter frowned. "For what?" Ethan stared at him. "For this." He gestured toward the kitchen, then upward toward the roof. "The heater, food, your prescriptions, taxes." "The plumbing," Calvin said, "froze last winter." Walter's expression changed slowly. Not guilt, confusion. "What money?" Ethan took out his phone. "Dad, don't do that." "Do what?" "Tell me you don't know what I'm talking about." Walter's jaw tightened. "I don't." Ethan opened his banking history. He searched Calvin's name. Transfers filled the screen. The regular ones were smaller. A few hundred here, 700 there, some months more. Then the larger payments. Roof, heating unit, property tax, medical, pipe repair. Ethan held the phone toward his father. Walter took it reluctantly. He scrolled once, then again. His weathered thumb stopped moving. "How long?" Walter asked. "What? How long have you been sending this much?" Ethan felt the first cold edge of fear beneath his anger. "Years." Walter looked down again. His eyes moved over the numbers. He handed the phone back. "I never saw this money." Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. "Calvin brought it to you." "No, he paid things for you." Sometimes. Sometimes? Walter moved toward the table and sat. The chair gave a tired creak beneath him. Calvin brought groceries now and then. Paid for a prescription once when I was short. Maybe twice. He brought $50 around Christmas one year. $50? He said some people at church had collected it. Ethan stood perfectly still. Rex entered from the hallway, nails tapping softly across the old floor. The German Shepherd paused between them, looked at Ethan, then Walter, and finally lowered himself beside the table. The simple act annoyed Ethan for reasons he could not explain. Everything in the room seemed too calm. The dog, the ticking clock. His father sitting there as if they were discussing a misplaced utility bill instead of years of money. I sent it every month. Walter looked up. I didn't know. Then why didn't you call me? Walter's face closed. There it was. The wall Ethan remembered from childhood. Dad, no answer. You had no food in the refrigerator. I have food. You have mustard. Walter almost smiled. Good mustard. Ethan did not. You let the roof rot. I didn't let anything rot. You're sitting outside diners waiting for food. The heater barely works. Your boot is tied together with cord, and you never thought maybe your son should know? Walter pushed the chair back. Know what? That you needed help. I did not need you worrying about me from 6,000 miles away. You needed somebody. And what would you have done? Ethan stopped. Walter stood now. Thinner than Ethan remembered, but suddenly filling the room in the way fathers sometimes still could. What would you have done, Ethan? Left your team because my gutter came down? That's not what I'm saying. Called me from somewhere you weren't supposed to name, and spent the whole night wondering if I had enough firewood? At least I would've known. Walter's voice rose. And I didn't want you to know. The words landed harder than the shouting. Rex raised his head. Neither man noticed at first. Walter looked toward the dark window. When you called, I wanted to hear your voice. That was enough. It wasn't enough for me. It was for me. You don't get to decide that for both of us. Walter turned back. And you don't get to come home after years and decide everything I did to keep you focused was some kind of crime. Ethan felt the answer forming. It would be cruel. He knew that before he said it, so he did not. Instead, he looked at Rex. The dog had moved without either of them noticing. Rex now lay directly between Ethan and Walter, his head resting on his paws, eyes moving from one man to the other. Walter saw it too. His shoulders dropped slightly. Even the dog thinks we're idiots, Walter muttered. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Despite everything, a laugh almost escaped him. Almost. Walter sat again. When he spoke this time, his voice was lower. Every time that phone rang from some number I didn't recognize, I wondered if it was going to be somebody telling me you weren't coming home. Ethan said nothing. Walter rubbed one hand over his face. So when it was you, I wasn't going to spend 10 minutes talking about shingles. The anger inside Ethan did not disappear. It changed shape. That was worse. Because anger at Walter was simple, understanding him was not. Later, after Walter went to bed, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table. Rex settled outside Walter's bedroom door. Ethan opened his banking history again. This time, he did not look only at the total. He looked at the pattern, the regular transfers, then the requests. $2. $300, heating system. $1,175, property tax shortfall. $640, Precisions lab work. $8,400, storm roof repair. $950, frozen pipeline. Some were separated by months. Some came within weeks of each other. The full amount over nearly 6 years was a little over $70,000. It had never felt like $70,000 while Ethan was sending it. Each request had arrived attached to a problem. A problem could be solved. That was how Ethan understood the world. Calvin would text. Ethan would transfer. Then another message would appear. Taken care of. Sometimes. Uncle Walt is fine. Ethan searched the phrase. It appeared again and again. Uncle Walt is fine. Walter's fine. Everything's handled. Uncle Walt is fine. Ethan leaned back. He remembered reading those messages in barracks, airports, temporary quarters, once from the back of a transport vehicle while rain hammered the roof. He had never asked for photographs of the repair, never asked for the original tax receipt, never asked Walter whether the new heater was working. He had transferred money and accepted confirmation. Because confirmation was efficient, because Calvin was family. But there was another answer Ethan did not like nearly as much. He had accepted it because he wanted it to be true. Uncle Walt is fine. 4 words. They had allowed Ethan to return to whatever was in front of him. He looked down the dark hallway. He did not know what blood pressure medication his father took. He did not know the doctor's name. He did not know how many winters the heater had been failing. He did not even know which room Walter slept in when rain came through the roof. Ethan closed the banking app. For years, he had measured responsibility by whether the transfer went through. Tonight, that idea felt embarrassingly small. He began gathering the unopened envelopes piled near the old telephone. Utility notices, insurance mail, store advertisements. Then one envelope from the county caught his attention. Pine Ridge County Property Office, past due. Ethan opened it. The notice was 6 months old. He read the amount, then the due date. Something in his memory clicked. He picked up the phone and searched Calvin's messages from the same week. There it was. Taxes paid. Uncle Walt doesn't need to worry. Ethan placed the tax notice beside the phone. This time he did not feel angry. He felt very still, because a broken roof could be explained. A misunderstanding could be explained. Even missing cash might have an explanation. But a county notice and a message saying the exact opposite could not both be true. And for the first time that night, Ethan stopped wondering whether something had gone wrong. He began wondering how long someone had been making sure he never knew it. Morning came into the coal house through the one window that still had clear glass. Ethan had slept badly, not because of the couch. He had slept in worse places than an old couch with a broken spring. What kept him awake was the county tax notice lying on the kitchen table. At 7 that morning, Walter came in wearing his faded navy flannel shirt and carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one in front of Ethan. No sugar. You remember. I'm old. Not dead. Ethan looked at the envelope. Walter followed his eyes. The humor left his face. Dad, Calvin told me this was paid. Walter pulled out a chair. I can see that. Did you know it wasn't? A long pause. Not at first. That answer was different from no. Ethan leaned back. What does that mean? Walter sipped his coffee. It means exactly what I said, Dad. Walter stared into the mug. Ethan recognized the strategy. Walter had used it when Ethan was 15 and wanted to know why his mother had been crying in the garage. Say as little as possible until the other person became tired of asking. Ethan was no longer 15. I need to know what else is here. Walter's jaw tightened. You planning to inventory my house? I'm asking permission. That made Walter look up. Ethan continued. No searching behind your back. No treating you like you can't handle your own affairs. But if something happened, I need to understand it. Walter remained silent for several seconds. Then he nodded toward the hallway. Bedroom, under the bed. Green metal box. It was not consent given easily. Ethan treated it accordingly. The box had once held tools. Now it held envelopes. Walter sat on the edge of the bed, while Ethan placed the papers beside him one at a time. A shut-off warning from the electric company. 2 past due notices. A letter concerning property taxes. A document bearing Calvin's name and language Ethan had to read twice before realizing it was a limited financial authorization. Then several letters from a development company interested in purchasing land along the eastern side of Pine Ridge. Ethan did not stop at those. His hand had found a hospital envelope. The date was 3 years old. He opened it. Emergency admission. 4 nights. Imaging. Cardiac monitoring. Follow-up instructions. Ethan read the first page twice. Then he looked at Walter. What happened? Walter looked at the floor. You fell? Got dizzy. You were hospitalized 4 days. 4 nights? Technically. Ethan stared at him. You're correcting the number? Might as well get something right. Dad. Walter's shoulders sank a fraction. Ethan held up the papers. You spent 4 nights in a hospital and never called me? I came home. That is not an answer. I know. The room went quiet. Outside, Rex moved across the porch. His collar gave a soft metallic click against the doorframe. Ethan lowered the papers. He had been angry the previous night. This was different. Last night had been about money and neglect and the frightening condition of a house. This was a piece of his father's life that had happened without him. 4 nights. Ethan tried to remember where he had been 3 years earlier. He could. He remembered the building, the weather, a broken coffee machine. He remembered calling Walter from a concrete hallway. Walter had said everything was fine. Ethan had believed him. You talked to me that week, Ethan said. Walter nodded. You told me you were fixing the lawnmower, was going to. You were in a hospital. One of those facts doesn't cancel the other. Ethan put the papers down harder than he intended. How many things have you done this with? Walter looked at him. Done what? Edited your life before you told it to me. That landed. Walter's face tightened. Every conversation with you did not need to become a list of what I needed. You needed your son. I had a son. You had a phone call. Walter stood. And sometimes that phone call was enough. Ethan rose too. No, it wasn't. For me it was. You keep deciding that for both of us. Walter's eyes sharpened. And you keep acting like knowing every bad thing that happened would put you here. Ethan stopped. Walter pointed vaguely beyond the wall, toward distances neither of them could see. You were doing a job where distraction gets people hurt. My father being sick is not a distraction. To you? Maybe not. To me, it was one more thing I could keep off your shoulders. Ethan almost answered immediately. Then he saw what Walter actually meant. It was not pride alone. Walter had needed a role. Ethan had become the man who went away, who carried responsibilities Walter could barely imagine. Walter had chosen to contribute by requiring nothing. It was misguided. It had hurt both of them. But in Walter's mind, silence had been something he could still give. Ethan sat back down. So who took you to the hospital? Walter's answer came without hesitation. Calvin? Ethan looked up. Walter continued. He came by that morning. Found me sitting on the kitchen floor because I was too stubborn to admit I couldn't stand up. He drove you? Stayed until they admitted me. Ethan said nothing. Brought me clothes the next morning. Paid for something at the pharmacy when I got out. Drove me home. Walter glanced toward the hallway. The back door hinge had broken while I was gone. He fixed it enough to close. Ethan's stomach tightened. Walter looked directly at him. And that first night home I ran a fever. Calvin stayed in the chair in the living room until morning. The story did not fit where Ethan wanted it to fit. He had spent the night arranging Calvin into a cleaner shape. Liar, thief. Man who took money from an old relative while pretending to help. Those things might still be true. But now another fact had entered the room. Calvin had been there. Walter seemed to read the resistance on Ethan's face. Not everything he did was fake. Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw. That doesn't explain the money. No. It doesn't explain the taxes. No. It doesn't explain why he knew about the diner. No. Walter's voice stayed level. But you asked what happened. I'm telling you. Ethan hated that answer because it was fair. By noon, Ethan had copied the documents Walter agreed he could take notes from and returned each original to the metal box. He did not want to turn the house into an investigation scene. More than that, he did not want Walter to feel as though his own papers had been seized by his son. One name on an old bank letter gave Ethan somewhere else to go. Martha Bell. Walter remembered her. Worked at Pine Ridge Community Bank forever. Think she'll talk to me? She'll tell you what she remembers. She won't tell you anything that isn't yours. Walter sounded almost approving. Good. Martha Bell lived 6 minutes away in a narrow brick house with trimmed boxwoods and wind chimes hanging from the porch. She answered wearing a grey cardigan and reading glasses attached to a burgundy cord. At 68, she held herself with the careful, straight posture of someone who had spent decades behind a counter, dealing with people who believed urgency should change rules. Ethan introduced himself. She studied his face. Walter's boy. Been a while since anyone called me that. That doesn't make it inaccurate. He liked her immediately. Inside, Ethan explained only what he needed to. He did not ask for Calvin's records. Martha made that boundary clear before he could have. I can't discuss anyone's account information, retired or not. I'm not asking you to. That softened her slightly. Ethan showed her a copy of the limited authorization Walter had allowed him to photograph. Martha adjusted her glasses. I remember this period. You remember Dad? I remember your father coming in with Calvin. More than once? A few times. What was Calvin doing? Helping him with paperwork, as far as I understood. Did Dad seem confused? Martha looked up immediately. No. The certainty surprised Ethan. He seemed irritated. That was normal for Walter whenever somebody made him sign more than one page. Despite himself, Ethan smiled. Martha continued. Calvin did most of the talking. Did that bother you? Not then. Why not? She removed her glasses. For the first time, regret entered her expression. Because I asked Walter if he was comfortable with Calvin helping him. What did he say? He said Calvin was family. Martha paused. Calvin said the same thing. Ethan waited. Martha looked toward the window. I've thought about that sentence more than once since. Ethan did not ask her to explain. She did anyway. People are careful with strangers. Family gets handed the keys. When Ethan returned home, Walter was at the kitchen table, repairing the loose buckle on Rex's old leather collar. Ethan set the photographed authorization on the table. What did Calvin tell you this was for? Walter did not look up. Pay bills if I couldn't get into town. Handle things if I was sick. Did you read all of it? The buckle stopped moving. Walter looked at him. Ethan immediately knew the answer. Dad, I read some. How much is some? Enough to recognize my own name. Ethan closed his eyes. Walter put the collar down. Go ahead. Go ahead what? Tell me I was stupid. Ethan wanted to, not because Walter was stupid, because anger offered somewhere to put fear. Instead, he asked, Why did you trust him that much? Walter held his gaze. Because I trusted him. Nothing more. No excuse. No elaborate defense. Just that. Ethan found he had no useful response. Rex walked over and pushed his nose beneath Walter's hand. Walter scratched behind the dog's left ear. The conversation ended there. Not resolved. Simply ended. Near dusk, gravel cracked beneath tires outside. Ethan looked through the front window. A pickup stopped beside his truck. Calvin stepped out. He wore a slate blue work jacket over a pale Henley and carried 2 grocery bags in one hand, a pharmacy sack in the other. A rolled blue tarp rested in the truck bed. He did not move like a man trying to disappear. He walked toward the porch as if arriving for a chore he had done 100 times. Walter became very still. Rex stood. Ethan opened the door before Calvin could knock. Calvin looked at him, then passed him toward Walter. His expression was tired rather than surprised. I figured we were done pretending you didn't have questions. He placed the groceries on the porch. Then the medicine. Calvin looked Ethan directly in the eye. You want to know where the money went? Ethan said nothing. Calvin stepped inside. Calvin did not sit until Walter did. It was such a small thing that Ethan almost missed it. For all the questions surrounding him, Calvin still waited for the older man to take his usual chair at the kitchen table before pulling out the one opposite Ethan. Rex settled beneath Ethan's right hand, body relaxed but eyes open. Calvin placed the grocery bags on the counter. Milk, bread, coffee, a package from the pharmacy, ordinary things. That irritated Ethan more than if Calvin had arrived empty-handed. You said you wanted to explain the money, Ethan said. Calvin took off his slate blue work jacket and draped it across the back of the chair. I said I figured you wanted to know. That's close enough. Ethan opened his phone and turned it across the table. The transfer history was already on the screen. 70,000 and change. Calvin looked at the number. He did not flinch. Walter watched both men. Calvin finally said, Over almost 6 years. That's supposed to make it smaller? No. Then where did it go? Calvin reached beneath his jacket and brought out a thick brown envelope. Walter's face changed slightly. You brought records? I figured he'd ask. Calvin emptied the envelope onto the table. Receipts, pharmacy statements, utility bills, a hospital payment, grocery receipts, a hardware store invoice for lumber and hinges. Ethan did not touch them immediately. You carry these around? No, I keep paperwork. Convenient. Calvin's right thumb rubbed once along the edge of his watch. Walter noticed. So did Ethan. Calvin pushed the first stack forward. Your dad's hospital copay 3 years ago. Another. Blood pressure prescription. Another. Electric bill when he was behind. Another. Groceries. Ethan started reading. The dates were real. The names matched. Walter recognized some of them. That pharmacy charge is right, Walter said quietly. Ethan looked at him. Walter nodded. So's the electric. Calvin leaned back. I never said I didn't use the money. You also haven't explained most of it. I'm getting there. Ethan's jaw tightened. No. You're showing me enough receipts to make me hesitate. Calvin looked at him for the first time with something close to anger. Maybe you should hesitate. The room went still. Rex lifted his head. Calvin leaned forward. You know what blood pressure medication Uncle Walt takes? Ethan said nothing. Calvin waited. You know his doctor's name? Still nothing. Which knee locks up when the weather turns cold? Walter shifted in his chair. Calvin, no. He wants the truth. Calvin looked directly at Ethan. Left knee. Ethan knew that now. He had learned it yesterday. Calvin continued. Dr. Sanderson, lisinopril. 10 milligrams in the morning unless his pressure drops too low. Ethan's fingers curled against the edge of the table. Calvin saw it. You know why I know that? Ethan did not answer. Because I was here. Calvin tapped one finger once against the wood. You sent money. Another tap. I was here. He did not raise his voice. That made it worse. Don't pretend those were the same thing. For several seconds, Ethan could not find a clean response. There wasn't one. That was the problem. Calvin had not told him anything that erased the missing money. He had not explained the overdue taxes. He had not explained the diner. But he had found the exact place Ethan was already wounded and pressed his thumb into it. Walter looked at Ethan. Don't let him turn this into something it isn't. Calvin turned toward him. What is it then? Walter's eyes hardened. A question about money. No. It stopped being just money a long time ago. Ethan looked between them. Then tell me what it became. Calvin sat back. For the first time since entering the house, he seemed tired. After Aunt Margaret died, Uncle Walt went downhill. Walter's mouth tightened. Calvin continued anyway. He drank more. Some. You missed medication a few times. You'd go days without answering the phone. I didn't like talking to you. Calvin almost smiled. That part I believe. Ethan glanced at Walter. Calvin continued. I offered to get somebody to fix the roof after the first storm. Walter interrupted. You offered me some kid charging twice what the job was worth. He was licensed. He was 23. Those two things can happen at the same time. Walter looked away. Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. The moment passed. Calvin said, He refused help more than once. Walter looked back. I refused your version of help. And then complained when things got worse. I didn't complain to you. No. You just made sure I found out. Ethan watched them. This was not a conversation being invented for his benefit. These arguments had happened before. The rhythm was too practiced. That unsettled him. He had spent the last 2 days learning how much of Walter's life he had missed. Now he was hearing the language of two people who had actually lived through those missing years together. Calvin looked at Ethan again. Your father isn't helpless. I know. He's also not easy. I know that too. Do you? That one landed? Walter spoke before Ethan could. Don't use me to excuse yourself. Calvin's expression changed. Not much. Enough. I'm not. You always do. Silence followed. Ethan looked at the receipts again. Some were clearly legitimate. Some payments had gone where they were supposed to. That truth did not make the rest cleaner. It made it messier. He had wanted one simple answer. Calvin stole everything. Walter knew nothing. Ethan had been fooled. But the room refused to give him that. Calvin had helped. Walter had resisted. Ethan had been absent, and somewhere inside those facts, money was still missing. Calvin gathered a few of the receipts into a neater stack. Then he said, almost casually, You tell him about the truck? Walter's head came up. Calvin. Ethan turned. What truck? Calvin looked at Walter. The Chevy. I know Dad sold it. Calvin nodded. You know where the money went? Walter's voice sharpened. Enough. It was only one word. But Ethan heard something in it he had not heard before. Not anger. Fear. Calvin stopped. For a moment, Ethan expected him to push. He did not. Instead, he looked back at Ethan. There are things Uncle Walt hasn't told you either. Walter stood. Get out. Calvin rose slowly. I came here because he asked where the money went. I didn't ask you. No, Ethan did. Walter's face had gone pale. Ethan stood as well. Dad, not now. Calvin put his jacket back on. The conversation was over. Not because anyone had answered enough. Because one sentence had reached a place Walter refused to let anyone touch. Calvin crossed into the living room before heading for the front door. Rex stood, not aggressively. The dog simply followed him. Ethan noticed. Calvin stopped beside the old walnut cabinet against the wall. He opened the upper drawer. Ethan took 2 steps into the room. What are you looking for? Calvin shut the drawer immediately. His prescription list. It's in the pharmacy bag. Calvin looked toward the kitchen. Right. His thumb rubbed the side of his watch again. Then he walked out. The pickup started a few seconds later. Walter remained at the table. Ethan waited until the sound of the engine disappeared down the road. Then he went to the cabinet. Walter called from behind him. Ethan. He opened it. Maybe he was looking for something. He said what he was looking for. Ethan pulled open the drawer. Old warranty papers. A flashlight. 2 dead batteries. Receipts from years ago. Then a long white envelope pushed against the back. Ethan removed it. Walter had come into the room now. What is that? Ethan slid out the contents. A photocopied document. Property description. Parcel number. A proposed sale agreement connected to several acres bordering the house. Ethan read the first page. Then the signature page. Walter Cole. The signature looked familiar. Ethan turned the paper toward his father. Walter took it. For several seconds he did not speak. What? Walter moved closer to the window. His eyes narrowed. Ethan watched his face. Dad? Walter touched the signature with one finger. That's my name. I can see that. Walter shook his head. That isn't what I said. He looked at Ethan. I didn't sign this. The room seemed to contract around them. Ethan took the paper back. You sure? Walter's expression hardened immediately. My hand shakes more now. It didn't then. He pointed to the last stroke. And I don't finish the C like that. Ethan looked again. It was a small difference. Maybe meaningless. Maybe not. Walter walked back to the kitchen without another word. Ethan did not call Calvin. Not yet. This had moved beyond what either of them could settle by shouting across a table. The next morning, Ethan took a copy of the document to a local attorney, Walter trusted enough to name. The lawyer did not declare it forged. He did something more useful. He slowed Ethan down. Don't decide what this is from one photocopy. Ethan sat across the desk. Walter says he didn't sign it. That matters. The attorney studied the pages. But this packet references other authorizations. Some signatures may be genuine. Some may not. Some may have been attached to documents differently than Walter understood. You're saying Calvin mixed things together. I'm saying we need originals before anybody says exactly what happened. The lawyer pointed to several dates. These signatures don't all look the same. Ethan leaned closer. The differences were subtle. A flatter E. A longer tail in the last name. One signature matched the limited authorization Walter had admitted signing. Another looked almost right. Almost. That was what bothered Ethan most. If everything had been fake, the answer would have been easy. If everything had been genuine, it would have been easy too. Instead, what sat on the desk looked like something built from both. Truth, permission, trust, and somewhere between them, something that did not belong. Ethan looked out the office window. For 2 days he had been asking himself whether Calvin was lying. Now he understood that might be the wrong question. A better one was much harder. How much truth did Calvin need in order to build a lie no one would notice? By 9 the next morning, Walter had signed 3 pages he actually understood. That mattered to Ethan more than he expected. The attorney from the previous day sat across from them, reading each paragraph aloud when Walter asked, and stopping whenever the older man wanted something explained twice. No rushing, no finger tapping beside a signature line, no one saying, "Trust me." When they finished, the remaining financial authorization Calvin had once used to handle Walter's bills was formally revoked. Walter capped the pen. That all? For today, the attorney said. Walter slid the papers back. Good. I've developed an allergy to signatures. Ethan almost smiled. The attorney turned several copies of the older documents toward them. Some of what Calvin handled was authorized. Paying certain bills, dealing with routine expenses when Walter couldn't get into town. That part is not unusual. And the land? Ethan asked. Different issue. He tapped the photocopied sale document. This authorization did not make Calvin an owner. It did not give him the right to sell Walter's property or promise a sale on Walter's behalf. Walter's jaw tightened. So if he told someone he could sell my land? That needs to be examined carefully. Ethan leaned forward. And the money? The financial side needs records neither you nor Walter can legally obtain on your own. The attorney's tone was deliberate. If there has been misuse, let the proper people request those records. Don't confront anyone for account details. Don't try to access anything that isn't yours. Ethan nodded. The advice irritated the part of him that wanted movement. But irritation was not the same as disagreement. The appropriate reports had already been started. The bank and local authorities could follow whatever trail existed. Ethan's job, for once, was not to kick open the next door. He had to wait. He discovered he was not especially good at that. Instead, he went back to Mill Creek Diner. The morning crowd had thinned. Bert Hanley was nowhere in sight. Helen Pierce was wiping a table near the window when Ethan entered. Her auburn and grey hair was pinned behind her left ear, and the small brass sunflower on her burgundy apron caught the light whenever she moved. She saw Ethan, stopped wiping. I wondered if you'd come back. I wondered if you'd talk to me. Helen glanced toward the kitchen. Then she sat across from him without being asked. For a moment she folded the cleaning rag between both hands. Your father wasn't begging the way people say. Ethan said nothing. Helen continued. There's a bakery 2 doors down. Woman who closes most evenings leaves soup sometimes. Biscuits. Bread she can't sell the next morning. Dad came here for that? For the overhang. Helen pointed through the window. When it rained, that wall stayed dry longer than the bus shelter. Ethan pictured Walter sitting there, not holding out his hand, just waiting for food someone else could no longer sell. The cup? People started dropping coins in it. Did he ask? Rarely. Helen looked down. He hated asking. That sounded like Walter. Too much like him. Helen rubbed the edge of the rag between her fingers. I gave him food when I could. Ethan looked at her. Then why did you stay inside the other morning? The question was not cruel. Helen reacted as though it was. Her face tightened. Because Bert owns the place. That didn't answer me. No, she swallowed. I was afraid he'd fire me. There was no dramatic defense after that. Just an older woman admitting something she did not respect about herself. Helen stared toward the side wall where Walter had sat. I kept giving him food because it was easier than asking why he had none. Ethan let the sentence sit. It was not really about soup. He understood that. Helen had found a small kindness she could perform without challenging the larger cruelty around it. Ethan wondered how different that was from wiring money and accepting the words Uncle Walt is fine. Not different enough for comfort. There's something else, Helen said. Ethan looked up. When Walter came around, Bert usually called somebody. Who? Calvin. Ethan's expression changed. You heard that? More than once. What did Bert say? That Calvin wanted to know when Walter was hanging around here. Bert said your cousin told him Walter caused problems. Did he? Helen shook her head. Walter could be grouchy. That isn't what I asked. No, he didn't cause problems. She looked toward the ceiling, thinking. There were times he muttered at people who bothered him. Once he told a man to stop feeding half a biscuit to a pigeon because the pigeon looked smarter than he did. Ethan stared at her. Helen's mouth twitched. That man deserved it. For the first time since entering the diner, Ethan laughed. A real one. Short but real. Then Helen became serious again. There's a camera across the street. The camera belonged to a small auto parts store facing the diner parking lot. Ethan did not demand access. Helen introduced him to the manager, and after Ethan explained why the morning incident mattered, the manager agreed to preserve the relevant footage and provide it properly when requested. They reviewed enough to answer one immediate question. Walter had sat outside Mill Creek many times. Most days he did exactly what Helen described. Sat under the overhang, accepted food. Occasionally spoke to someone. No fighting. No threatening customers. No scenes that matched the picture Bert had apparently been given. Then came the morning Ethan returned. The footage showed Walter, Bert, the bucket, Ethan running into frame, Rex moving between Bert and Walter, and several minutes earlier, the black pickup Walter had watched so carefully. Ethan leaned toward the monitor. That's not Calvin's truck. No, the store manager said. I know that one. You do? Belongs to Graham Pike. The name meant nothing to Ethan. The manager pointed toward the screen. Works land deals around here. Graham Pike was 52, tall and lean, with steel gray hair combed neatly back and the polished, unhurried manner of a man accustomed to making difficult things sound routine. Ethan found his name connected to the development company that had sent Walter the land letters. That did not make Graham a criminal. It did make the black pickup matter. When Ethan and the attorney later spoke with Graham, the man arrived wearing a Taupfield blazer and carrying a thin black leather portfolio. He did not deny knowing Calvin. Calvin approached us as someone who could help move the conversation along. What conversation? Ethan asked. Your father's property. My father said no. Graham paused. He said no initially. And Calvin told you that would change? He said Walter could be persuaded. Walter sat beside Ethan. Did Calvin tell you he owned any part of my property? No. Did he tell you he had authority to sell it? Graham chose his next words carefully. He represented himself as someone involved in your financial affairs. That isn't what I asked. Graham looked at Walter. No. Walter leaned back. So you didn't ask too many questions. Graham's expression remained controlled. We were interested in acquiring the parcel. That's another way of saying yes. The attorney intervened before the conversation became an argument. Graham eventually acknowledged there had been discussion of a consulting payment to Calvin if he could help bring Walter to an agreement. No grand conspiracy. No secret plan written in a back room. Something more ordinary. A man wanted a deal. Another man claimed he could deliver it, and neither had been eager to examine where persuasion ended and authority began. Ethan found that almost more disturbing. The financial picture began changing at the same time. Not through anything Ethan uncovered himself, through records requested by people authorized to examine them. The first findings were incomplete, but the pattern was already visible. Calvin had used some of Ethan's money exactly as promised. Groceries, medicine, utilities, hospital-related expenses, small repairs. Then, over time, the amounts retained by Calvin began to grow. $100, $200, more. Some transfers could still have explanations. Others did not line up cleanly with Walter's expenses. The troubling part was not one dramatic theft. It was the gradual change. Ethan could almost see how Calvin might have justified the first 100. Gas money. Time. Driving Walter to appointments. Fixing a door at midnight. Doing what Ethan was not there to do. Then perhaps another 100 felt easier. Then 5. Then there was no longer a line, only a habit. Ethan remembered Calvin at the kitchen table. You sent money, I was here. For the first time, Ethan understood that Calvin might not have begun by thinking, I'm stealing from Walter. He might have begun with something far more dangerous. I'm owed this. That did not excuse him. It explained how a man who once stayed beside Walter through a fever could become a man who lied about paid taxes. That evening, Ethan returned home to find Walter on the porch with Rex at his feet. The old truck came back into Ethan's mind. He sat beside his father. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan said, Calvin brought up the Chevy yesterday. Walter's hand stopped on Rex's neck. I know. I want to understand. Walter looked toward the road. The old response was there, the refusal. Ethan could see it forming. He could also feel his own instinct rising with it. Ask another question. Press. Find the weak point. Get the answer. That instinct had kept him alive in places where missing information carried consequences. But this was not an interrogation. Walter was not a source. He was his father. Ethan stood. When you're ready. Walter looked up sharply. That was all Ethan said. He went inside. For once, he left an unanswered question unanswered. Several hours later, Ethan was preparing the couch when he heard Walter in the doorway. The old man held something in his palm, a worn Chevrolet key on a cracked leather fob. Walter walked in and set it on the small table. The metal made a quiet sound against the wood. Ethan looked at the key, then at his father. Walter remained standing. You wanted to know why I sold the truck? Ethan sat down. He did not reach for the key. Yes. Walter looked older than he had that morning, not weaker. Just tired of carrying something. He took a breath. I knew Calvin was taking your money 3 years ago. Ethan did not move. Walter pulled out the chair opposite him. This time, Ethan did not ask a second question. Walter was finally ready to answer the first. Walter did not touch the old Chevrolet key after setting it on the table. Neither did Ethan. For a while, both men simply looked at it. The leather fob had split along one edge. The stamped Chevy emblem had been rubbed almost smooth by years in Walter's pocket. Ethan remembered that truck. Dark green, bench seat, a heater that worked only when it felt respected. Walter had taught him to drive in it when he was 16, one hand gripping the dashboard while pretending not to be terrified. Now the truck was gone. The key remained. Walter sat across from Ethan. Rex lay beneath the table, his long body stretched between their chairs. You said you knew 3 years ago, Ethan said. Walter nodded. How? Walter rubbed his thumb across the scarred tabletop. After the hospital, his voice was different tonight. No sarcasm. No attempt to change the subject. When Calvin brought me home, I was going through bills. He'd paid for the prescription, like I told you. There was a transfer notice mixed in with some bank papers. Walter paused. Your name was on it. Ethan waited. It was more money than I'd ever seen Calvin bring me. How much? Enough, Ethan nearly asked again. He stopped himself. Walter noticed. 2,400. Ethan remembered the transfer, hospital expenses and recovery. He had sent it after Calvin told him Walter had suffered a small spell but was already home and fine. At the time, Ethan had been angry Calvin waited until Walter was out of the hospital to mention it. He had never known Walter himself was unaware of the money. What did Calvin say? Walter gave a tired laugh. First thing? Yeah. Said I misunderstood. And then he stopped pretending. Walter looked toward the dark kitchen window. He cried. Ethan had not expected that, Walter continued. Not movie crying, not dropping to his knees asking forgiveness. He sat right where you're sitting and covered his face with both hands. Calvin told Walter his small contracting business had collapsed. A partner had walked away. There were debts, late payments, a loan Calvin had hidden from everyone. He said he had used some of Ethan's money because he intended to replace it before anyone noticed. Walter had heard that sentence for what it was, a confession trying to dress itself as a temporary mistake. I told him to leave, Walter said. Why didn't you call me? Walter's eyes stayed on the table, because he asked for one chance. Ethan leaned back. That's all it took? No. Walter finally looked at him. It took 19 years before that. Ethan said nothing. Walter reached down and picked up the old key. Calvin was 19 when his father died. Ethan knew the broad version. Uncle Dean had died suddenly. Calvin had struggled afterward, but Ethan had already been leaving home more often by then. Training, service, a life moving outward. Walter had stayed. Calvin had nowhere useful to go, Walter said. His mother was barely keeping herself together. He was angry at everybody. Couldn't keep a job for more than 3 weeks. Walter looked toward the living room. He slept on that couch. The same couch Ethan had been using since returning home. Walter taught Calvin basic engine repair in the garage, showed him how to change brake pads without stripping bolts, how to listen to a bad bearing, how to show up before a shift started instead of exactly when the clock turned. Walter found him a job with a local mechanic. When Calvin's first paycheck came, Walter made him buy groceries for the house. Why? Ethan asked. So he understood staying somewhere meant contributing. A faint smile appeared. He bought 6 cans of chili, 3 frozen pizzas, and enough soda to kill a horse. Ethan smiled despite himself. Walter's expression softened for only a moment. Then it was gone. When Calvin sat here 3 years ago telling me he'd taken your money, I didn't see the man you see now. Walter closed his fist around the key. I saw that 19-year-old kid on the couch, wondering if anybody still wanted him. There it was. Not stupidity, not blindness. Memory. Walter had not forgiven an abstract thief. He had forgiven someone whose worst moment collided with the best version of him Walter still remembered. Ethan understood that much. He also understood how dangerous it had become. So you gave him another chance. Walter nodded. More than that. His hand opened. The key lay in his palm. I sold the Chevy. Ethan looked at him. For Calvin? He said if he could clear the worst debt, he could straighten everything out. How much did you give him? Enough to make me miss the truck. Walter tried to smile. Ethan did not. Dad, $7,000. Ethan stared at him. You sold your truck and gave him $7,000 after finding out he was already taking money from me? Walter's mouth tightened. There was the old reflex in Ethan. Pressure. Disbelief. The need to force logic onto something that had never been logical. But this time he saw Walter's face before continuing. Not defensive. Ashamed. Ethan let the anger go past him without putting it into words. Instead, he asked one question. Did he stop? Walter looked at the key. No. The answer was barely louder than the heater clicking in the next room. That single word changed the room more than shouting would have. Walter set the key down again. For a while, I thought he had. Then small things stopped making sense. A bill Calvin said was paid arrived again. A pharmacy account went overdue. Walter found another notice he should never have received. When he confronted Calvin a second time, Calvin no longer cried. He became angry. Said Walter did not understand how much time he had sacrificed. Said Ethan sent money from far away while Calvin did all the work. Ethan remembered almost the same words at the kitchen table. You sent money. I was here. The sentence had not been invented for Ethan. Calvin had been telling himself that story for years. Walter rubbed both hands together. The first time he knew he'd done wrong. What about later? Later he thought he was owed. Ethan looked down at Rex. The dog slept now, one ear flicking whenever either man moved. Walter continued. The worst part wasn't him fooling me. He took a slow breath. The worst part was knowing. Ethan looked up. I knew something was wrong. I knew I'd given him a second chance he didn't deserve. Walter swallowed. And I still didn't tell you. Why? Walter's gaze stayed steady this time. Because then I'd have to tell you I'd let it happen. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Walter continued before Ethan could answer. "I could hear you asking me why I signed things, why I trusted him, why I sold the truck." "I wouldn't have." "Yes, you would." Walter raised a hand. "You might not have meant it badly, but you would have asked." Ethan could not deny it. Walter looked toward the hallway. "And then I started thinking maybe you'd come home." "That's what you wanted." Walter shook his head. "I wanted you to want to come home." The distinction silenced Ethan. "I didn't want you showing up because the old man had become another assignment." Ethan looked away. Walter had said something cruel without trying to be cruel. That made it worse. A mission, a problem, a responsibility to solve. Ethan understood those things well. Being needed without being wanted was different. Walter leaned back. "I had one son I was proud of on the other side of the world." He glanced toward the living room. "And another boy I'd once treated like a son standing 10 miles away and turning into somebody I didn't recognize." His voice cracked slightly. "I didn't know how to tell either story without admitting I'd lost both of you in different ways." Ethan sat very still. Then he said, "You weren't the only one pretending." Walter looked at him. Ethan took his phone from the table but did not open it. "Every time Calvin wrote, 'Uncle Walt is fine,' I believed him. You didn't know. I didn't ask." Walter started to object. Ethan shook his head. "I liked the answer." That stopped him. "It let me keep doing what I was doing without thinking too hard about what 6 years looked like for you." Walter looked down. Ethan continued, "I sent money because I thought money could cover the part of me that wasn't here." Neither man spoke after that. There was no apology large enough for 6 years. No sentence that repaired Walter's pride or Ethan's absence. Rex shifted beneath the table. Walter reached across slowly and put one hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan covered it with his own. That was all. For the moment, it was enough. The attorney called later that night. Ethan put the call on speaker so Walter could hear. The financial review was still ongoing, but one fact had become clear. Calvin had accepted an advance connected to his promised role in moving the land deal forward, not payment for selling Walter's property. He did not own it. Instead, Calvin had been promised compensation for helping bring Walter to an agreement. Walter gave a bitter laugh. "So I became a sales commission." The attorney did not laugh. "There's more you should know." Calvin had also begun defending the earlier money transfers. His position was that Walter had knowingly allowed him to retain some of the funds as compensation for years of help. More troubling, Calvin had begun suggesting Walter's memory was inconsistent and that some of Walter's current claims might be influenced by Ethan's return. Ethan's expression hardened. Walter said nothing. The attorney continued carefully. "If this moves forward, Walter, you may have to answer questions about things you'd rather keep private. I figured. Your drinking after Margaret died, missed medication, the papers you signed, the truck, the fact that you discovered at least some misuse years ago and chose not to report it then." Ethan looked at his father. Walter stared at the old Chevrolet key. This was the price of speaking now. He would not be allowed to tell only the parts that made him look wise. To establish what Calvin had done, Walter might have to explain every mistake that made it possible. After the call ended, Ethan said, "You don't have to decide tonight." Walter picked up the key. For several seconds, he turned it between his fingers. Then he slipped it into his pocket. "Yes, I do." The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of running water. Walter had shaved, not perfectly. A small patch of white stubble remained beneath the left side of his jaw. He had combed his white hair back and put on his cleanest navy shirt. The brown canvas coat waited by the door. Rex watched him from the hallway. Ethan stood near the kitchen. "You sure?" Walter buttoned the last button at his wrist. "No." Ethan almost spoke. Walter looked at him. "But I've been quiet long enough." They drove without much conversation. Walter kept one hand on Rex's neck in the back seat. When they reached the office where he was scheduled to give his formal account, Ethan parked. Walter opened the door, then stopped. He turned toward his son. "Ethan, yeah? Don't speak for me in there." Ethan frowned. "I wasn't planning to." "You planned for everything. That was fair." Walter stepped out, then leaned back toward the open door. "This time, let me tell it." Ethan looked at his father. For most of the week, he had thought bringing Walter home meant taking control of what happened next. Only now did he understand. Walter did not need someone to take over his life. He needed someone to stand beside him while he took it back. Ethan nodded. "All right." Walter closed the door, and for the first time since Ethan found him outside the diner, the old man walked ahead. Walter did exactly what he had asked Ethan to let him do. He spoke for himself. The interview room was plain enough to make honesty uncomfortable. Grey walls, a rectangular table, a box of tissues no one touched. Rex was not allowed inside, so Ethan had left him resting in the truck with the windows cracked and the morning air still cool. Ethan sat beside his father, not in front, not between Walter and the questions, beside him. The investigator began with dates. Walter answered what he remembered. When he did not remember, he said so. When he was uncertain, he did not guess. Then the questions became harder. Did Calvin ever help you willingly? Yes. Did you trust him? Yes. Did you sign documents he gave you? Yes. Did you read all of them? Walter looked down at his hands. No, there was no attempt to soften it. No speech about age. No excuse. Walter continued. Some I read, some I didn't. Some I thought I understood. The investigator asked about Margaret's death. Walter's jaw tightened. I drank too much for a while. Ethan looked at him. Walter did not look back. I skipped my medication sometimes, turned people away, got angry when they tried to help. Did Calvin know this? Yes. Did he use those things to argue you couldn't manage your affairs? Eventually. The room went quiet. Then Walter added something no one had asked. I also lied to my son. Ethan turned. Walter kept looking forward. I told Ethan I was fine when I wasn't, more than once. The investigator waited. Walter continued. I knew Calvin had taken money 3 years ago. I gave him another chance. I even sold my truck to help him. Ethan had already heard those words. Hearing Walter say them here was different. There was no kitchen table to hide behind. No Rex beneath their chairs. No family shorthand. Just the truth placed down where strangers could examine it. Walter rubbed his thumb against one knuckle. If you're asking whether Calvin fooled some helpless old man who didn't know his own name, the answer is no. His voice remained steady. I made bad decisions. He paused. But they were my decisions. Then he looked directly at the investigator, and Calvin still took advantage of them. Ethan felt something inside him settle, not because Walter sounded strong, because he sounded whole. He was not asking anyone to erase his mistakes in order to believe what had been done to him. When Ethan's turn came, he offered what was actually his to provide. His transfer history, the dates, the amounts, and Calvin's messages. The investigator scrolled through copies Ethan had provided. Uncle Walt got the money, another. Roof handled, another. Medication paid. Then the one Ethan had stared at alone in the kitchen. Taxes taken care of. Uncle Walt doesn't need to worry. The county notice said otherwise. Ethan did not make a speech about betrayal. He did not need to. Dates had a way of becoming louder when placed next to each other. The rest would be handled by people with legal authority to obtain financial records. Ethan could not. Walter's authorization had already been revoked. The proposed land transaction was placed on hold while the matter was reviewed. Calvin's claim that some money represented informal compensation would have to be tested against the records, messages, receipts, and Walter's account. No one promised Walter an easy ending. No one promised Ethan that every dollar would come back. And Calvin was not marched through town in handcuffs while people applauded. Real consequences were quieter than that. Lawyers called. Records were requested. Accounts were examined. The land deal stopped moving. For Ethan, that was enough for now. He had spent years believing problems ended at the moment the right person was identified. Family had taught him otherwise. Sometimes identifying what went wrong was only the beginning. Bert Hanley faced consequences of his own. The footage of him throwing water on Walter had not disappeared just because something larger was happening behind it. Customers complained. The diner's business suffered. Within weeks, Bert was no longer running Mill Creek in the same way he had before. Ethan did not celebrate. Walter seemed even less interested. Man threw water on me, he said when Ethan mentioned it. He didn't become the center of my life. That was Walter. Anger had its place. He simply refused to rent it a room forever. Helen Pierce left Mill Creek not long after. One afternoon, she appeared at Walter's house carrying a paper bag filled with fresh bread. No diner apron this time. No brass sunflower pinned to her chest. She looked smaller without the uniform. Walter opened the door. Helen held out the bag. I should have come outside that morning. Walter looked at her for a moment. You should have. Helen swallowed. I'm sorry. He accepted the bread. She waited for him to tell her it was all right. He did not. Instead, Walter said, "Next time, speak sooner." Helen nodded. "I will." "Good." Then Walter opened the door wider. "You want coffee?" That was the closest thing to forgiveness Walter knew how to offer. It was enough. The house did not repair itself because the truth came out. That would have been convenient. The roof still leaked. The porch still sagged. The heater still made a noise like an old man objecting to stairs. So they fixed things, slowly. Martha Bell gave Walter the number of a roofer she trusted. Helen brought food twice, and then stopped when Walter complained that his refrigerator was starting to look like a charity warehouse. A man named Dale, one of the breakfast customers who had laughed outside the diner, arrived one Saturday carrying a box of nails and several lengths of lumber. He stood at the edge of the yard, looking as though he would rather face a dentist. Walter was measuring a porch board. Dale cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole." Walter looked up. "I was there that morning. I remember." Dale shifted the box from one hand to the other. "I was wrong." Walter nodded. "Yeah." Dale waited. Walter went back to measuring. After several uncomfortable seconds, Dale said, "That it?" Walter looked at the lumber. "If you feel that bad, quit standing there and carry those boards around back." Dale blinked. Ethan, halfway up a ladder, started laughing. Walter did too. Dale shook his head and picked up the lumber. It was not absolution. It was work. Walter seemed to prefer that. Over the next several days, Rex gradually reorganized his loyalties. At least, that was Ethan's accusation. Every morning, Walter stepped onto the porch with coffee, and Rex followed. If Walter went to the mailbox, Rex went to the mailbox. If Walter sat beneath the old maple tree, Rex settled nearby with his head on his paws. One afternoon, Ethan came outside and found Walter asleep in a chair with Rex stretched across the porch in front of him. "You know he's my dog," Ethan said when Walter woke. Walter scratched Rex behind the notched left ear. "He hasn't mentioned you. Traitor." Rex opened one eye. Walter smiled. "See? Guilty conscience." The joke lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds mattered. For most of Ethan's visit, Rex had existed between tension and uncertainty. Now the dog was simply part of the house. Ethan realized he had not heard Walter laugh much when he first arrived. Now he heard it almost every day. Not because everything had been fixed, because everything no longer had to be hidden. By the time Ethan's leave was ending, the house was still unmistakably old. That mattered too. No miracle renovation transformed it into something Walter would not recognize. The new roof was watertight. The heater worked reliably. The porch had been reinforced. The broken window panes had been replaced. There was food in the refrigerator. Walter's medication sat in a weekly organizer he complained about and used anyway. The brown canvas coat still hung beside the door. The old kitchen table still carried decades of scratches, and Walter was still Walter. Ethan preferred it that way. On the morning Ethan had to return to his unit, neither man mentioned departure during breakfast. Walter cooked eggs too long. Ethan ate them without complaint. Rex knew something was happening before either man said it aloud. He followed Ethan while bags went into the truck, then returned to Walter, then back to Ethan. Finally, there was nothing left to load. The two men stood beside the vehicle. Ethan looked toward the repaired roof, then at his father. "I'm sorry." Walter raised one eyebrow. "That covers a lot of territory." Ethan smiled faintly, for thinking sending money was enough. Walter looked at him for several seconds, then nodded. "I'm sorry too." "For what?" "For thinking silence was protecting you." Neither apology erased anything. That was not what apologies were for. They simply stopped both men from pretending the past had happened differently. Walter put one hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Next time you send money through somebody else, I'm spending it on something stupid. Not happening." "A boat. You hate boats. Exactly. Stupid." Ethan laughed. Walter's hand remained on his shoulder. "And call." "I will. Not when you remember." "Every week." Walter narrowed his eyes. "What day?" "Sunday." "Morning, if I can." Walter considered that. Ethan nodded. "Sunday." Walter extended his hand. Ethan ignored it and pulled him into a hug. For half a second, Walter stayed stiff. Then his arms closed around his son. Neither man said anything. They had spent enough years trusting silence to say things it could not. This time they did not ask it to. Ethan opened the truck door. "Rex!" The German shepherd approached, then stopped. He looked up at Ethan, then back at Walter. Walter folded his arms. "See?" Ethan pointed into the truck. He's thinking about the step. He's thinking about retirement options. He's my dog, apparently under review. Ethan shook his head. He just likes old people. Walter smiled. Then give it a few years. You'll be his favorite. Ethan laughed as Rex finally climbed inside. That was the last sound Walter heard before the door closed. At the end of the driveway, Ethan looked into the rearview mirror. Walter stood on the porch, one hand raised. The house behind him was smaller than Ethan remembered from childhood. Maybe it always had been. Ethan had believed the worst thing waiting for him in Pine Ridge was the sight of his father outside a diner in torn clothes. It was not. The harder truth was that Walter had suffered for years, while Ethan lived comfortably inside 4 words. Uncle Walt is fine. Calvin had exploited the distance between them. But Calvin had not created all of it. Some of that distance had been built by Walter's pride, some by Ethan's absence, some by 2 men trying to protect each other, without ever asking whether protection was what the other one needed. Ethan could not recover 6 years. He could not send enough money to purchase them back. The roof could be replaced, the land could be protected, wood could be cut, bills could be paid. Time worked differently. Once spent, it stayed spent. Ethan turned onto the highway. Rex settled beside him. Pine Ridge disappeared behind the trees. On the passenger seat, Ethan's phone lay face up. Before leaving town, he had created one recurring reminder. Sunday, call Dad. For once, the promise he was taking with him had nothing to do with money. Sometimes the people we love are not asking us to solve their lives. They are simply hoping we will notice when something has changed. Ethan sent money because he cared. Walter stayed silent because he cared. Yet between those 2 good intentions, years quietly slipped away. So if someone you love has been on your mind today, don't wait for the perfect reason to reach out. Make the call. Ask the second question. Stay long enough to hear the real answer. If this story reminded you of someone, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories about loyalty, family, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. May you never be too busy to hear the people who are still waiting for your voice.